Hello and welcome to ANM News. Namaskar, this is Avijit Nandi Mazumdar and we are with a senior IS officer talking on a very interesting topic. Let's welcome Mr. Krishna Gupta, Additional Chief Secretary, Government of West Bengal to our program. Welcome Mr. Gupta. For a change, we are not discussing what you hold, the post that you are holding here in the Government of West Bengal. We want to discuss something on climate change. The very first question that I want to ask you is, how do international negotiations on climate change occur? Because this is something that's very interesting and very relevant.
So, before I answer that, I would just like to retrace my steps on how I got interested in climate change. You know that I was posted in the Indian mission to the World Trade Organization in Geneva as India's negotiating team for trade negotiations. So, one of the issues that I was handling was trade in environmental goods and services. So, there was this area was basically an overlap between international trade and climate environment. And the European Union wanted to follow a list approach that all countries would submit a list of various environmental goods and services, or an agreed list of environmental goods and services, in which there would be discussions on how climate change can be, the adverse effects of climate change can be controlled. And so that's where I started doing a lot of research and reading. My core competence continues to be trade theory and trade policy and economics of trade theory. But I really got interested. I've been reading a lot in recent years on climate change, and so basically now, to answer your question, negotiations on climate change take place in a multilateral forum. So, for trade, it takes place in the World Trade Organization. For climate change, that takes place under the aegis of what is UNFSCCC. So, United Nations Framework, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change Convention. So, what happens is that the UNFCCC meets every year in what is known as a Conference of Parties, and this has an interesting history. This was formed in early 1990s. If you recall, there was a Rio Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1990, where countries were worried about rising greenhouse gas emissions, and so there was a felt need by the major countries of the world to have a forum where such issues could be discussed. So, out of the Rio Earth Summit, one of the conventions that emerged was the Framework Convention on Climate Change. There was also the Convention on Biological Diversity, CBD, and Agenda 21, where 21 issues of sustainability and development were listed, and these also. So, the Rio Earth was basically the mother, where the place where climate change negotiations happen. So, today there are 193 countries who are members of the UNFCCC. The last year's climate change conference, the COP, was I think held in Glasgow, if I am not mistaken, and where India asked for massive increase in climate financing to $1 trillion. There are other issues that were discussed, but this is how shortly. So, what happens in the Conference of Parties is that they are supported by various reports from what is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They do all the scientific research, the policy research, and they submit it to the Framework Convention, and there are other subordinate bodies under the UNFCCC which produce documents, and of course, the other important part nowadays of the COPs, the Conference of Parties, is to see how various countries have done on nationally determined contributions, which was what was agreed in the Paris Agreement in 2015, COP, the Conference of Parties of Paris in 2021, I think. And there, every country had voluntarily to submit a target of, what all are you going to do to reduce your carbon footprint. So, in short, that's how international climate negotiations take place.
Then what are the key features of the Kyoto Protocol?
So, what happened, in the early years, the first conference of parties was held in 1995, where there was already a discussion going on that there should be a protocol amongst all countries which should give targets to countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, 95, 96 were preparatory years. Finally, in 1997, it happened in Kyoto, the Conference of Parties, the third Conference of Parties, it took place in Kyoto in Japan. And since there was already a lot of discussions, many countries agreed that there should be legally binding targets for developed countries or industrialized countries to reduce their carbon footprint, meaning their greenhouse gas emissions. And this target was set for various countries, and 37 developed and industrialized countries were given these emission reduction targets. And the initial target was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5% over the 1990 levels, and the first commitment period was 2008 to 2012. So, before 2012, all countries, the 37 industrial countries, were given a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 5%. And of course, greenhouse gas emissions primarily are carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, and there are others, perfluorocarbons and sulfur, hexafluoride and so on. But it's primarily carbon dioxide and methane.
So, has it been done?
Yes, the treaty was signed.
The 37 countries managed to reduce emissions.
No. So, now that is the interesting part. So, when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, it took a while before it could be signed, because there were not enough countries on board. All 37 industrial countries did not agree. The US did not agree. The US's point was that with major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions out of the remit, how can we agree, or how can only developed countries agree? Now, ever since the UNFCCC was formed, this was the cornerstone of the agreements that developing countries will not be asked to take commitments. Binding commitments would be taken only by developed countries, because they were responsible for the historical greenhouse gas emissions. The stock of greenhouse gases was the responsibility of developed countries, and therefore they should take the first step. Developing countries will not be asked to take any commitments, but the US was not happy, because India and China and Brazil were out of this mandated target. So, interestingly, what happened was that George Bush actually in 2001 said so, that we will not be part of this, and ultimately America did not sign the Kyoto Protocol. So, the minimum requirement was of signing the Kyoto Protocol was the 55-55 requirement. So, 55 countries should sign on at least, and these 55 countries should be accountable for 55% of greenhouse gas emissions. So, they were not reaching that 55% number, because India and China were out, the US is not signing. So, it was basically EU, the European Union, who was driving this whole negotiation. Ultimately, the Russians were asked to come on board. There was a quid pro quo. Russians said, okay, Russia said, okay, we will sign on, but you also have to give us WTO membership. And so, this was a trade-off that the EU did with Russia, because EU was invested in the Kyoto Protocol. EU has always been a flag bearer, the driving force for the climate change negotiations internationally. That's another matter, whether their own emissions trading scheme or the single renewable energy directive, how it's fared is another debate. We will get to that later.
So, what are the key features of the Paris Agreement then?
So, the whole Conference of Parties there have been 27, 28 conference of parties. Another one is going to be held this year in Brazil. The two main conference of parties which actually yielded an agreement were one, the third conference of parties which yielded the Kyoto Protocol, and the Paris Agreement adopted in 2015. Again, when countries saw that the targets of greenhouse gas emissions in Kyoto Protocol were not really being met, there were other elements of Kyoto Protocol such as a market mechanism for having an emissions trading program and adaptation funds and so on. But countries were worried that warming is continuing and adverse climate events are still continuing, and one is witnessing a steady increase in average mean temperatures, global average mean temperatures, and therefore it was decided that there should be a more participatory and a more stringent kind of an agreement, and in 2015, after many false starts, including the 2009 Copenhagen Conference of Parties, where Barack Obama tried to sit down with the developing countries and come to an agreement, which failed spectacularly, by the way. In 2015, the Paris Agreement, everybody came on board. Now, this was also a very challenging objective. So ultimately, it was decided that there would be voluntary, nationally determined contributions, what are known as NDCs, and temperature warming targets were set that the mean or average global temperature would not rise to by more than 2 degrees centigrade over and above the prehistoric levels, and that is what 2 degrees centigrade was the target. 1.5 degrees centigrade was the ambition. But obviously 1.5 degrees centigrade has not been met. We know that because of the recent activity that has led to temperature rises to, there have been instances of 1.5 degrees centigrade rises in global average temperature. So 2 degrees centigrade was what was the target for limiting global warming to. As I said, nationally determined contributions. There were, every country would submit national climate action plans which would set out what you are going to do to reduce greenhouse gases or your energy intensity or your carbon footprint and so on. There was a more transparent reporting system. Countries would meet every 5 years to review their NDCs, to submit fresh NDCs, NDCs being nationally determined contributions, and there was also talk of financial contribution of US $100 billion every year till 2020. So create a stock which would help developing countries in adaptation measures. Adaptation measures are important, more important for developing countries because they're more vulnerable to climate change, and financially their social safety nets are weaker, and financially they are weaker. So developed countries they agreed to come together and put in this. But again, US has done a flip-flop on joining the Paris Agreement. Whenever there is a democratic president, they join, and when Trump comes, they walk out. Wow. So Trump again walked out recently after he was elected to Paris, of the Paris Agreement. Biden had rejoined the Paris Agreement, if you recall.
So Biden has rejoined and Trump has walked out. As of now, US is not a part of the Paris Agreement.
No, at the moment, the US is not a part
Then
of
what are the issues related to climate finance and climate justice that the developing countries speak of?
Yes. See, let me start with climate finance. So climate finance, as I said, in Paris, there was an agreement that all developed countries would come together and give $100 billion per year. I already mentioned that. In the COP29 that was held in, it was held in Baku actually, it was not held in Dublin, Glasgow, as I said, it was held in Baku. India demanded that $1 trillion be raised. But a significant outcome was that there was a new quantified goal on climate finance to mobilize $300 billion by 2035. India said that that's too little, at least $1 trillion should have been raised. But anyway, so climate finance has been a sticky point because developed countries have not contributed as much as was promised in the early years of the negotiations. As I mentioned, COP29, which took place in Baku, Azerbaijan last year, only $300 billion was promised. Now, this is just a brief overview. Now, coming to climate justice. So, ever since the negotiations under UNFCCC have taken place, they began, India and other developing countries have said that the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities should be followed. What does it mean? It means that everybody would have a responsibility to lower greenhouse gases, to lower the carbon footprint, but it would be differentiated by the level of development of the country, and therefore developing countries would be given more time and more leeway as compared to developed countries, because developed countries have been responsible for most of the cumulative emissions that have happened on the face of the earth. So, that is what climate justice is all about, and developed countries have not really been following this dictum. And interestingly, there was a ruling at the International Court of Justice at Hague this year, I think last month, which actually ruled that developed countries have a legal binding responsibility to both Kyoto Protocol reduction in greenhouse gases as well as Paris Agreement, and the ruling also upheld the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. It said that all the targets that will be assigned to various countries would also include cumulative emissions, which means the bulk of which have been done by developed countries. So, that is climate justice, that there has to be justice in targets, there have to be justice in how people are going about contributing to this fight against climate change.
Absolutely. And lastly, what are the current status of climate change negotiation?
Okay, so there are pessimists who say that the whole Conference of Parties structure is an utter failure, and what we need to be doing is we need to be doing much more than what is discussed at the Conference of Parties. There is some truth to that, because it is mostly what is known as jaw-jaw, what Winston Churchill had called jaw-jaw, means talk, diplomacy, rather than war. So, it is a lot of talk, but what needs to be done is far in excess of what is happening at the various Conference of Party discussions. Why do I say that? One, climate finance. I already told you that not enough money is being raised for adaptation, for loss and damage happening in developing countries, in the Pacific Islands, in the Caribbean Islands. The emissions continue. Interestingly, the Rio Earth Summit took place in 1990. In the last 35 years, rather than greenhouse gas emissions coming down, they have recorded probably one of the largest increases in history
of greenhouse
gases. The reason, of course, has been the very impressive industrialization of China, but that has come at a huge cost. And that is, if so, there is an estimate that if China had not industrialized at the level at which it has, the crisis of greenhouse gas emissions would not have reached such proportions. But now that's neither here nor there, because all countries have a right to provide for their citizens. All countries have a right to pursue a path of economic growth. The only way possible for China and India is coal. And that is why climate finance becomes very important, because if we have to shift to non-coal, non-fossil fuel energy or non-fossil fuel steel production or cement production, it will cost a lot of money. It will require the latest technologies, which the West has. So, this transfer of technology and financing is extremely important if climate change negotiations are to be successful. Of course, it is a huge issue, but we still have a long way to go.
Absolutely. One thing that is very clear, transfer of technology is very important. Greenhouse emission has gone up, and Donald Trump has walked out of the Paris Agreement.
Absolutely.
So, it looks very bleak at the moment for the climate change
absolutely.
future.
So, I will just before we end, I will just, there is a book by a British economist called Dieter Helm, Dieterhelm, in which the title of the book is Net Zero, how to achieve net zero. And in that book he says that countries have to be more honest about their intents. Also, he goes down to the consumer, that's you and me, and it's not just about production, it's not about net zero. Net zero is what is it saying? Net zero is the amount of emissions that you do will be lower than the amount of emissions that you avoid. What Dieter Helm is saying is that you also have to focus on consumption. The carbon that is inherited that is a part of the consumption. So, supposing as a country X says that I will stop all emissions, I will deindustrialize, I will not produce steel, I will not produce cement, which are all high fossil fuel consuming industries, we will shift to electric, but they import their steel and they import their cement, which means that they have just shifted the problem of greenhouse gas emissions to the country where which they are importing from. So, not only do we have to focus on production, we also have to focus on consumption, and that comes down to each citizen of this world. So, everyone, if they maintain a carbon diary, you have to make conscious choice, everybody, and this all governments have to do. And it is a very interesting thing that this conference of parties discussions are okay, but we have to go far beyond what is being discussed.
That was very, very interesting, Mr. Gupta. Thank you so much for sharing so many things on climate change. We will keep on coming back to Mr. Krishna Gupta on climate change. This is something that we have been very vocal about, and we will be discussing a lot of climate change in future with Mr. Krishna Gupta. Thanks for watching ANM News. Keep watching ANM News. Thank you.
আরও খবরের আপডেট পেতে সাবস্ক্রাইব করুন আমাদের ইউটিউব চ্যানেলটি আর বেল আইকনে ক্লিক করুন নোটিফিকেশনস পেতে।